Vidrio Financial is proud to support Improving Alpha, Innovation in Investing, ESG and Technology with Michael Oliver Weinberg. Vidrio helps allocators harness investment complexity to make better allocation decisions. Learn more at vidrio.com. That's vidrio.com.
We would like to welcome everyone to the Improving Alpha, Innovation in Investing, ESG, and Technology podcast series. Today, Greg Steinmetz is kind enough to join us. So listeners have a high-level sense of our roadmap for today. This episode will be slightly more theoretical, though Greg is a practicing asset manager. The reason we brought him on the show is that he's also an accomplished author. He's written 2 fascinating books. The episode will not be directly about innovation in investing, ESG, and technology. However, we believe our astute listeners, particularly asset managers and owners, will be fascinated by the 2 legends in finance that Greg has chronicled. Moreover, the parallels between some of this from 5 centuries and over a century ago to today are remarkable. We'll start with some background color, then discuss the 2 books. On that note, welcome, Greg.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
My pleasure. Let's start with your background, a very brief overview of your career and how you got to your asset management role, as well as being an author.
Well, my first job after graduating from college was writing ad copy for a department store in Cleveland. But then I got a lucky break. A friend of mine's father called me up. He was a money manager in Cleveland. He gave me an analyst job with his firm. But after a year of doing that, I decided it was not enough money too much money and not enough work. So I became a journalist. It's a joke. I did that for about 15 years. I finished up as Berlin bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal and then became the London bureau chief. And again, good fortune lined up. I got a call from the guy who was the head of research at Ruane, Cunniff and Goldfarb, the manager of the Sequoia Fund. He said, we're looking for some journalists to do deep digging into our portfolio companies. So I switched, and I've been doing that for the last 22 years while writing books on the side.
And at Soros, I had some colleagues who are also formerly journalists, and it makes sense from the investigative research perspective. Let's start though with your first book. The Richest Man Who Ever Lived, a somewhat audacious title. Why is it not John D. Rockefeller or Elon Musk or one of the multitude of others? I'll let you unveil to the listeners who it is, but it's really someone that I think almost no one had heard of until you unearthed him. But again, you could provide more color on that.
Okay. The subject of that book is a banker in Renaissance Germany, the same time as Leonardo da Vinci and Christopher Columbus, named Jacob Fugger. And his claim to fame is having financed the Habsburgs, which turned them from being a sort of minor aristocratic family in Europe to the rulers of half the world, including parts of South America. And Fugger also is responsible for kicking off the Reformation because he was bankrolling the Pope at the time that Martin Luther was trying to turn things upside down. The reason I was able to call him the richest man who ever lived, which was something my publisher was very happy about, is that if you look at how the standard way of calculating wealth across time is to divide someone's net worth by the prevailing gross domestic product. And I was able to do that with Fugger, and it came out to $400 billion. You do the same sort of calculation for Rockefeller, and you get about $250 billion. So if you toss out people like Mansa Musa, who was a king and was born into wealth, and you toss out other kings who didn't have to earn their money, then Fugger is indeed the richest man who ever lived. Interesting.
What lessons did you learn from Fugger?
Among the interesting things that I learned from Fugger was it's very important for a business that wants to be successful and keep growing, even after achieving enormous scale, is you have to make yourself indispensable. Had Fugger not made himself indispensable, the Emperor Charles V would have just tossed him in jail and seized all his assets. But he knew that he was the only one on the face of the earth who could come up with money in a pinch whenever Charles needed it to fight his wars. So as an investor, if you can find a company that has those traits and can get it at a good price, it's where you want to be. Another thing I learned from Fugger is the importance of keeping good numbers. At the time, double entry bookkeeping was around. It was in Italy. Fugger was the one who brought it north of the Alps. And unlike his rivals in Germany, he always knew where he stood financially. Others didn't even bother keeping records. To the extent they did, they might scribble something somewhere and forget where it was. They just kept everything in their head. But Fugger was very on top of things. And again, as an investor now, you see companies that are a little bit sloppy. You see companies that lie to themselves about their financial condition. And Fugger was very cold-blooded about how he evaluated his own business and those of his competitors.
Yeah, and now obviously we see companies like FTX who are, as you mentioned, companies are sloppy and or don't have records. So you have this whole lack of audit in the crypto world, which to me is entirely unacceptable. I just don't understand why, why these companies can't hold themselves to the same standards that I publicly traded Western companies do. But that's another whole discussion. But interesting that those lessons and parallels hold today. So when you are investing, presumably you're looking for those companies that are indispensable with a low elasticity of demand, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, Warren Buffett talks about moats. And Fugger had a moat. He had all the rights to mine silver and copper throughout the Habsburg Empire. The emperor could have taken it away from him at any moment, but it would be sort of like taking away the ability of Exxon and other oil producers who know what they're doing, take their expertise out of the Gulf of Mexico. It wouldn't work as well in the hands of others.
What will likely transpire in Russia now that the Western companies are leaving, and what's transpired in South America and other places when Western oil companies, for example, have left. Well, it seems like he was a reputable, ethical, and clearly superb business person. Is that right, or do I have that wrong?
Well, he was his claim for being ethical is what he did with his money. He created the world's first public housing project. At the time, there weren't any places where people who worked hard but couldn't afford a roof over their head could live. People would be living shacks outside of town. The gates of medieval villages would open in the morning. They would all stream in, do their work for the well-to-do folks in the city, and then go back to their shacks in the fields at night. Fugger thought, well, that's not right. If someone is working hard, they deserve a roof over their head. So he built this housing complex called the Fuggerei, named after himself, where he charged nominal rent as long as people lived up to his standards for how people should live, which is to come home every night at a decent hour before the gates closed, to not be drunk and rabble-rousing within the facility, and also, which was very important to him, pray 3 times a day for his salvation. And the Fuggerei is still in business today, charging exactly what it did 500 years ago. And I don't know if people are still praying for Fugger's salvation, but according to the documents they signed to get in, they're supposed to.
Super interesting. That's quite a testament, considering the time. I mean, there, you had more of that centuries later, but for that time, to your point, I mean, he was early on that.
Yeah, well, he was looking to save his soul, so it wasn't all altruistic.
Got it. Fair point. But nonetheless, a positive externality for society. What was the funniest or most inconceivable story you unearthed while researching it that it was or wasn't in the book?
Well, it is in the book, but I was not an expert in medieval history before looking into this, but it's just so fascinating the way people lived, how so many things are different today, but how many things are the same. One thing that was different was the water quality was horrible. So instead of drinking water from the well, people would drink beer, and they'd drink it all day long. It was 2%. It was enough to kill the bacteria, but it kept them healthy. but they were drunk all day, every day. So Fugger managed to make all his money while he was buzzed.
Oh, that is funny. I did the benefit of drinking alcohol and in those times. I've read multiple other books that have sort of touched on that. Okay. And then look, what happened to the Fugger fortune? Where is it today? Is it still around? And
the Fugger family is now 21 generations past Jacob Fugger. Many of them are still rich, even though there are hundreds of them. But what they did, which was smart, is they continued to marry into other fortunes. And also, foremost, they started with a very big number. They continued to invest. They continued to marry well. And more recently, they created a foundation to keep the money out of the hands of German tax authorities. So there are still plenty of rich Fuggers living high on the hog in Europe, partly because of luck and partly because of very good planning.
Very interesting. All right. Let's now segue 3 centuries later in time to the protagonist in your second book, American Rascal, how Jay Gould built Wall Street's biggest fortune. For starters, how did Gould stack up in the robber baron hierarchy? And then how did he compare in today's dollars to Fugger?
Well, in the robber baron hierarchy, who do we got? We got Rockefeller on top, then we got Carnegie,
yep.
And there's some others.
Frick, Vanderbilt, right?
Vanderbilt, yeah. In the list of all-time richest Americans, again calculated by dividing worth by GDP, Jay Gould was 14th between Warren Buffett and Marshall Fields on several of these lists. His fortune in today's dollars would be about $80 billion. Rockefeller, again, about 250, 260. But what's interesting is Rockefeller lived until he was 93. He had more than 3 decades of compounding than Gould ever had a chance. So if you think you can double your money every 10 years at 7%, you do that calculation, he would have died with more money than Rockefeller. And at the time that Gould died, he was on par with Rockefeller. Rockefeller's came into exceptional, world-beating wealth after the advent of the automobile and the need for gas. And that happened, later in his life. So Gould, as a businessman, was as successful as any of them during his lifetime. And in fact, Rockefeller called him the smartest businessman he ever came across, and Vanderbilt said the exact same thing.
Well, I think there's if I'm not mistaken, there's a funny story on that, right? Do you want to share that, or?
Well, there's plenty of funny stories, but I'll tell you 2 of them. One was Gould and Vanderbilt were fighting for control of the Erie Railroad. Vanderbilt had the New York Central, Gould wanted Erie, and if Vanderbilt had succeeded in getting Erie, he would have had a monopoly crossing New York State, which was very important because grain and cattle came up through the Great Lakes, dropped off on a train in Buffalo, and taken to New York City, where the market was. During some negotiations to settle a lawsuit between Gould and Vanderbilt, Gould sent his partner, Jim Fisk, who is this larger-than-life character, who is a celebrity in New York for some of his antics, sent him to negotiate with Vanderbilt. On a Sunday morning, when Vanderbilt was still in bed, Fisk just walks right in the door, right past the butler, encounters Vanderbilt in his bedroom just as Vanderbilt's getting up in the morning. And while he's negotiating this deal, he's staring at Vanderbilt's shoes. He can't get over just how great those shoes look. And he's thinking to himself at the same time he's trying to save the Erie Railroad for Gould, where can I get those shoes? So I thought that was interesting, that's the priority for Fisk. And then another story,
that's funny,
also involving Fisk, and Gould was in this too. There was a rate war between the Erie and the New York Central. And Vanderbilt was trying to kill Gould by making the Erie money losing, that it couldn't pay its debts. And he cuts the rate all the way from, let's say it was $100 all the way down to $1, just giving away freight transportation for free across New York State. So Gould, in a demonstration of second level thinking, he says, okay, if freight rates are going to going to be zero. What can I do? Well, I can transport stuff from Chicago to New York for free. In this case, he transported cattle across the state and sold the cows at a huge profit because there weren't any freight costs, and the freight was more than the cost of the cows. And when Vanderbilt found out about it, he swore a blue streak.
That's a great story. What lessons did you learn from Gould, or should people learn from Gould, or did people learn from Gould?
A couple of things that I didn't appreciate before was that panics and recessions come and go. I've lived through several, but these things were longer and deeper during Gould's time because there weren't any. You didn't have things like the Greenspan put and now the Powell put. People got wiped out. And even after, you would have a horrible recession, but then things would come back stronger than ever. So in the panic of 1857, the long depression of 1873, the recession of 1893, America just came out of these better than ever. And at times like this, that gives me comfort. I know we're going to come out of this. Let's hope it's not another 7 years in the tank like we had during the long depression of 1873, but we will emerge from this. And I think it makes it a little easier for me to keep my thoughts on an even keel. Another thing I appreciated is how powerful a mechanism, some of these old world protections we had. And what I mean by that is buyer beware was the only investor protection that there existed in those days. And I think it made people a little sharper than maybe there are now. Certainly the crypto folks learned at their peril about buyer beware, and particularly those who were naive enough to think that there was something like FDI insurance backing their crypto investments, or that they actually still held their tokens when in fact they were only lending to crypto exchanges and were just dependent on the exchanges to repay their bills. They couldn't just get their coins out again. And if there had been maybe more buyer beware experiences when the people who lost money were younger, they might have avoided these pitfalls. So those are the sort of lessons. A lot of the investing lessons from watching what Gould did directly no longer apply, because in those days, insider trading was legal, self-dealing was legal. I could own a company on the side of a publicly held company that I ran and funnel business to it, my printing supplies, my energy needs. And this was all legal. And Gould availed himself of everything that was both legal and extra legal, bribing judges. Of course, I wouldn't recommend that to anyone, but in those days it was commonplace and easy to get away with.
Unbelievable. So it truly was the Wild West. And it does sound eerily similar to some of the markets you and I were just discussing that are apropos today, and with their sort of lack of regulation, lack of regulator, intentional decentralization to avoid regulation, all of which, in my view, should be addressed to protect investors. Previously, I was at a large pension, and one of their primary tenets was fair markets from an ESG perspective. And it sounds as though many of the rules today precluding market manipulation and other things were actually a function of Gould. Is that right?
Yeah, without question. There was absolutely no regulation that applied to commerce apart from the rules against stealing and conspiracy. There was a rule against bribery, but the legislature changed the rule in New York to make it so difficult to prove that you could do it with impunity. The rule was you could only convict someone for bribery if a third party actually saw the cash change hands. So I could bribe you, and if there was no one else in the room, if it was my word against yours, and there was no other evidence, you'd walk. So you could get away with anything in those days. What happened after this battle between Gould and Vanderbilt for control of the Erie Railroad is people took notice. And a guy named Charles Francis Adams, who was the great-grandson of John Adams and the grandson of John Quincy Adams, took it upon himself to stir up public opinion and get Massachusetts, where he lived, to be the first state in the union with a regulatory commission. And now we have the SEC, we have the FDIC, you can go down the list. We have dozens and dozens of federal regulatory agencies, commissions, bureaus, and then even more in the state. And here in New York City, we even have consumer protection agencies. There's absolutely nothing like that before Gould and the outrage that he kicked up. Mark Twain called him the greatest misfortune ever to befall the country, and that was because Gould set such a bad example, but ultimately inspiring example for the next generation, subsequent generation of crooks, that in Twain's mind, he ruined the country. But we did get the start of regulation. We saw the Massachusetts Railroad Commission right after the fight between Gould and Vanderbilt and all the bribery that went on with that. Other states followed up. And then in the late 1880s, we got the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was the first federal regulatory agency. And then the Progressive Era followed, and the SEC came along in the Depression, on and on.
So it sounds like in terms of fair markets, a lot of good came out of him, out of his sort of negative externalities and these things for society and fair markets and leveling the playing field. Yeah.
And it's like crypto today, in that when the country shifted from being an agricultural based economy to an industrial one, lawmakers didn't know what to do about it. And it took them a long time to wake up to the need for regulation. And then it took them time to figure out exactly what to do about it. So the Interstate Commerce Commission was also the result of Gould in a way, because it was the railroads that needed regulating, and that's what the Interstate Commerce Commission was going after. And Gould owned more rails than anyone and built more track than anyone. So Gould again played an inadvertent role in creating the first federal regulatory agency.
Yeah, and to your point, today we have effectively the SEC and the CFTC. And possibly some others, but at least those two, effectively disagreeing on who should regulate crypto and how it should be regulated. So,
yeah, but it's amazing, right? We still have crooks. So we have 40,000 laws on the books to regulate commerce and finance, and the same stuff that was going on in Gould's time. Read about what happened with FTX, and I think this is straight out of the Wild West days of Wall Street, the 1870s. It's crazy.
Totally. To your point, strategies, right, that have long been illegal in public security markets, like front running and market manipulation and effectively insider trading and all these things, are not illegal or regulated in crypto. And it is inconceivable. I completely agree.
Well, that's where buyer beware would be a nice thing for people.
Or caveat emptor, as
caveat emptor.
Right. Exactly. Couldn't agree more. My personal view is there are unfortunately likely more shoes to drop. You still have firms in the industry paying rates of interest that are unsustainable in my view, and that, you can only achieve three ways: risk, leverage, or fraud. I wrote an article on this summer, right, that was published on September 28th by CAIA, the Chartered Alternative Investment Association. And that was sort of 2 months before FTX. And unfortunately, I still see likely multiple other particularly large firms that are out there with what I suspect will likely be a similar phenomenon. May take a year or more, like a sort of Madoff, where these things can take time to unwind. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, the Madoff thing, again, we have all these regulations, but they didn't catch him, even when they were getting warnings about it. So we have all these regulations, and yet it goes on. So I suppose I wouldn't want to live in a world where we didn't have things like deposit insurance. But in researching Gould, it did make me think about what the world would look like. There are those who argue that insider trading is a good thing because it helps with price discovery. There's arguments against every financial regulation we have, and as a Series 7 holder, I have to be fingerprinted to do my job. That seems a little excessive to me.
Yeah. Let's shift gears. But to your point, look, I think you made another point that's just worth mentioning, which was society, yeah, the safety nets that we have today are incomparable to the ones that were, in Gould's time and certainly Fugger's time. And those safety nets ranging from, the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, unemployment insurance, all of these, the Fed put, the Fed's sensitivity to employment and inflation and the business cycle, all of these safety nets are to your point, dampeners or likely to, diminish, the reaction to the pandemic. I mean, but that's another whole discussion.
Yeah, smooth out the business cycle, which is the holy grail since the time of FDR.
Right. Or tried to anyway. What happened, wrapping up Gould, what happened to his fortune? Be an interesting contrast here versus Fugger. And why don't we hear about, there's the Frick Museum, which I love going to. There's Carnegie Hall, which I love going to. There's, there are colleges named after all the other robber barons. Why aren't there any Gould named not-for-profit entities?
Well, first off, Gould divided up his assets equally among his 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. And that was different than Vanderbilt. What Vanderbilt did was he gave 95% of it to the oldest of, I think he had 10 kids. That ended up in court. Some of the others said that's not fair, but Vanderbilt, or in the case of his son, William Vanderbilt, prevailed and got to keep all the money. Vanderbilt wanted to keep the corpus intact so it could keep getting bigger and bigger. And again, because of compounding, William Vanderbilt, who wasn't considered by his father to be the brightest bulb out there, doubled the family fortune. And so that was kept intact. Gould divided it up. Among the 6, 4 of them sort of squandered it. They spent very lavishly, in striking contrast to their father, who was very frugal. One of them built the biggest estate in New Jersey. Others married French nobility, and the people they married squandered the money. But some of them, well, all of them maybe, kept enough of it so that several generations down the road, there are still very rich Goulds out there. You don't hear about them, but they've done very well. And I got an email after writing the book from one of them who said, great job. I really liked what you did with this. And it was a guy who worked for a Lazard in France, and his last name wasn't Gould, but Talleyrand. So he married into a aristocratic French family, kept the fortune intact. Talleyrand was Napoleon's diplomat. He was the chief negotiator for Napoleon. So the Goulds, they're quiet about it, but they still have money. They're modest people. The other question was why don't we know about them? Well, I mentioned that Gould died at a much younger age than Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Rockefeller. If you look at when Carnegie Center was created, if you look at when Rockefeller Center, when the dirt moved on that, and if you look at Vanderbilt University, all of these things were endowed at an age of these men that was older than when Gould died. Gould died when he was 56 of tuberculosis, before he could give much thought. He was still in the wealth accumulation stage. We don't know. Maybe he would have just given it all to his kids, but he was in negotiations with New York University, and who knows? Had he lived longer, NYU might now be called Gould University.
Interesting. Super interesting. Anything we didn't mention on either of them, or advice or thoughts on the investing world that you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
Well, the thing I really liked about the Gould book is how much action there is in the book. I make the argument that it was the Wild West of Wall Street. This was the same era when Jesse James was robbing trains and robbing banks out west. The same stuff was going on in Wall Street. There was vigilante justice. The book opens with Gould getting punched in the nose by one of his opponents. There's a kidnapping. There's a murder. There's an anarchist throwing a bomb at Gould's partner, Russell Sage. It was a very colorful time, and it showed me that the Wild West wasn't just something that was going on out west. It was happening right here in New York. And another thing that really struck me was, although Gould was a crook, and he, like I said, used legal but also extra legal means to make his fortune, he wasn't going after widows and orphans. He was going after other people who were trying to do the same thing to him. It's one thing if you're Madoff and you're preying on naive investors. It's another thing if you're Carl Icahn going up against Bill Ackman in a street fight. And what Gould was doing was sitting at the same poker table with people who were trying to destroy him, whether it be through short squeezes or other means. So Mark Twain may have thought that he was the most evil thing ever to hit the country. I'm not sure about that. I think there have been worse cases of financial fraud that have dragged in a lot more innocent victims than those who suffered from Gould.
Wow. Well, your discussion of the action and the fighting and the murder and the all of this, it sounds like an opera. Maybe I'll write the libretto based on your book.
There you go.
All right. Well, look, we'd like to thank you for that super interesting discussion and sharing your most valuable asset with us, your time. We hope listeners have a better appreciation how one of the world's preeminent financial biographers has chronicled the lives of two legendary financiers, one in the old world and the other in the relatively newer world. This is your host, Michael Oliver Weinberg, hoping you join us again for our next episode, where we'll speak with another thought leader who will provide insight into improving alpha via innovation. Until then, stay well, and thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you for listening to Improving Alpha, Innovation in Investing, ESG and Technology, sponsored by Vidrio Financial. With Vidrio Financial, asset managers, endowments and foundations, pensions, family offices, insurance plans and sovereign wealth funds can cut through the complexity of asset allocation to reduce costs, mitigate portfolio risk, optimize compliance controls, and improve performance analytics. Interested to learn more? Contact us today at vidrio.com. That's vidrio.com. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Vidrio Financial and/or our host, Michael Oliver Weinberg. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding investment planning.